In October 1918, as the First World War entered its final brutal weeks, approximately 554 American soldiers advanced into the dense Argonne Forest in northeastern France. Led by Major Charles White Whittlesey, these men from the 77th Division, mostly New York draftees with little combat experience, were tasked with breaking through German defenses as part of the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive. What should have been a coordinated advance turned into a nightmare when the units on their flanks failed to keep pace, leaving Whittlesey's battalion exposed and vulnerable. By October 3rd, they found themselves completely surrounded in a ravine now known as the Charlevoix Valley. Cut off from all supplies, reinforcements, and communication, the men dug in, unaware that they were about to endure 6 days of absolute hell that would test every limit of human endurance. The term Lost Battalion would later become one of the most famous misnomers in military history. The battalion wasn't actually lost. Headquarters knew approximately where they were, but they were isolated, surrounded, and facing annihilation. The soldiers consisted of men from 9 different companies: 6 from the 308th Infantry Regiment, 1 from the 307th Infantry, and 2 companies from the 306th Machine Gun Battalion. These weren't professional soldiers, but ordinary Americans, Jewish immigrants from the Lower East Side, Irish laborers, Italian shopkeepers, and farm boys from upstate New York. They had been drafted into service and thrust into one of the most horrific battlegrounds of the entire war. The Argonne Forest itself was a death trap. Dense undergrowth limited visibility to mere yards, making it impossible to see enemy positions until it was too late. The terrain was broken by steep ravines, rocky outcroppings, and thick vegetation that turned every movement into an exhausting struggle. German forces had occupied this territory for 4 years, constructing elaborate defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, hidden machine gun nests, and pre-registered artillery coordinates. The Americans were walking into a killing ground that the Germans knew intimately and had prepared meticulously to defend. As a battalion pushed deeper into enemy territory on October 2nd, Whittlesey received orders to advance aggressively and maintain the momentum of the offensive. A Harvard-educated lawyer turned reluctant warrior, Whittlesey was an unlikely military hero. Tall, thin, bespectacled, and soft-spoken, but he possessed an iron will and an unwavering sense of duty that would define the coming ordeal. When he realized that supporting units had fallen behind and his flanks were exposed, he faced an agonizing decision: retreat to safety or hold position as ordered. Following his orders to the letter, he chose to dig in and wait for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. By the evening of October 3rd, German forces had completely encircled the American position. Whittlesey's men occupied a roughly 300-yard stretch of hillside, with Germans above them on the ridges, and below them in the valley. The soldiers scraped shallow foxholes into the rocky soil with their entrenching tools, knowing these meager holes would be their only protection for days to come. They had advanced with minimal supplies, just 1 day's rations, limited ammunition, and no heavy weapons. Their water supply consisted of a single muddy stream at the bottom of the ravine, which German snipers and machine gunners quickly covered with deadly fire. The first night brought terror unlike anything these men had experienced. German soldiers probed their perimeter, testing for weaknesses, while machine gun fire raked the American positions at irregular intervals. Men whispered prayers in the darkness, clutching their rifles with white-knuckled desperation. They didn't know it yet, but 190 of them would soon disappear into a fog of war, some killed and obliterated by artillery, others wounded and captured, still others lost in the chaotic hell that was about to unfold. The Lost Battalion's ordeal had only just begun. Charles White Whittlesey was perhaps the most unlikely military commander in American history. Born in Wisconsin in 1884, he had built a successful legal career in New York City, becoming a partner in a prestigious Wall Street law firm specializing in corporate law. Tall and gangly at 6 feet tall, but weighing only 130 pounds, he wore thick wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of bookish academic rather than a battle-hardened soldier. His quiet demeanor and intellectual bearing led many to underestimate him, but beneath that scholarly exterior lay a core of absolute steel. When America entered World War I in April 1917, Whittlesey was 33 years old enough to avoid the draft. Yet his sense of duty compelled him to volunteer for officer training at the first opportunity. He attended the officers' training camp at Plattsburgh, New York, where he was commissioned as a captain despite having no prior military experience. His commanding officers quickly recognized his analytical mind and attention to detail, qualities that serve him well in law, but would be tested beyond imagination in combat. Within months, he was promoted to major and given command of the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division. The 77th Division was unique among American units in France. Nicknamed the Metropolitan Division or Melting Pot Division, it consisted primarily of draftees from New York City, a diverse mixture of immigrants and first-generation Americans. Many spoke English as a second language, or not at all. The roster included names like Cohen, O'Brien, Kozakowski, and Calabrese, a cross-section of New York's ethnic neighborhoods. These weren't the farm boys and small-town Americans that filled many units. These were urban men more familiar with subway platforms and military formations. Welding them into an effective fighting force required patience, determination, and leadership, qualities Whittlesey possessed in abundance. Despite his lack of military background, Whittlesey approached command with the same meticulous attention he had applied to legal cases. He studied tactics, learned from experienced officers, and most importantly, earned the respect of his men through his willingness to share their hardships. Unlike some officers who maintained distance from their troops, Whittlesey slept in the same trenches, ate the same rations, and exposed himself to the same dangers. His men noticed. They might have initially mocked his awkward gait and scholarly appearance, but they came to trust him completely. By October 1918, Whittlesey had survived nearly a year of combat in France. He had led his men through brutal engagements and earned the reputation as a competent, if cautious, commander who looked after his soldiers. His superiors, however, sometimes viewed his caution as excessive. Division Commander Major General Robert Alexander wanted aggressive action to break through German lines before the war's end. Alexander and his staff officers, operating from headquarters miles behind the front lines, had little appreciation for the actual conditions in the Argonne Forest. They saw lines on maps and issued orders accordingly, expecting their subordinate commanders to execute regardless of circumstances. On the morning of October 2nd, 1918, Whittlesey received his orders: advance into the Argonne Forest, break through German defenses, and maintain pressure on the enemy. The orders emphasized speed and aggression, get behind German lines and create havoc. Whittlesey had reservations. Reports from reconnaissance patrols indicated heavy German concentrations ahead, and the terrain was nightmarishly difficult. But orders were orders, and Whittlesey was above all else a man who followed orders. It was this quality, this rigid adherence to duty, that would lead a battalion into hell and paradoxically save those who survived. As Whittlesey's battalion moved forward into the forest on October 2nd, he repeatedly sent runners back to headquarters requesting information about the units that were supposed to advance on his flanks. The runners returned with vague assurances that support would arrive soon. Hour by hour, Whittlesey pushed deeper into German-held territory, his unease growing with each step. By nightfall on October 2nd, he had advanced nearly a kilometer beyond any other American unit. His flanks were completely exposed. Any competent military commander would have recognized this as an untenable position, but Whittlesey's orders had been clear: advance and hold. So that's precisely what he did, making the decision that would define his life and haunt him until his death 3 years later. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, launched on September 26, 1918, represented the American Expeditionary Force's largest operation of World War I. Over 1.2 million American soldiers were committed to breaking through heavily fortified German positions in northeastern France. The objective was strategically vital: capture the Sedan-Mézières railway that supplied German forces along the Western Front, forcing them either to retreat or face encirclement. The offensive would eventually prove decisive in ending the war, but at an appalling cost. 26,277 American soldiers killed and 95,786 wounded over 47 days of combat. The Argonne Forest occupied a critical position in the German defensive system. This ancient woodland, covering roughly 200 square kilometers, had been transformed into a fortress over 4 years of German occupation. The Germans constructed elaborate trench systems, concrete bunkers, barbed wire entanglements stretching hundreds of yards deep, and carefully positioned machine gun nests that could deliver interlocking fields of fire. Artillery observers on the high ridges could call down precise barrages on any position in the valley below. The forest itself was their ally. Thick underbrush and broken terrain made coordinated attacks nearly impossible and gave defenders every advantage. American commanders, however, underestimated the strength of German positions in the Argonne. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were demoralized and weakening after 4 years of war. This assessment was partially correct. Many German units were understrength and suffering from poor morale, but it failed to account for the elite troops that Germany had concentrated in this sector. The soldiers defending the Argonne included battle-hardened veterans who had survived years of combat on both the eastern and western fronts. They weren't about to surrender their positions easily. When the offensive launched on September 26th, initial American advances achieved some success. But within days, the attack bogged down in the face of fierce German resistance. The 77th Division, including Whittlesey's battalion, was committed to battle on September 26 as part of I Corps. For nearly a week, they fought through brutal combat to advance yard by bloody yard through the forest. The division suffered horrific casualties during this initial push. Entire companies were decimated by machine gun fire and artillery. By October 1st, the division had advanced roughly 5 kilometers at a cost of thousands of casualties. Despite the heavy losses, divisional headquarters remained convinced that one more push could break through German lines. On October 1st, General Alexander ordered a renewed assault for the following day. The plan called for a coordinated advance by multiple battalions on a broad front. Whittlesey's 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry would advance in the center, supported by companies from other regiments on both flanks. If successful, the attack would penetrate German positions and emerge into more open terrain behind enemy lines, where American superiority in men and material could be brought to bear effectively. On the morning of October 2nd, Whittlesey assembled his battalion for the attack. The men were already exhausted from a week of continuous combat. Many had not slept more than a few hours in days. Their uniforms were filthy, torn by barbed wire, and stained with the mud of countless shell holes. Despite their fatigue, they checked their weapons, fixed bayonets, and prepared to advance. At 6:30 a.m., whistles blew along the line, and the men climbed out of their positions and moved forward into the forest. The advance began badly and deteriorated from there. Almost immediately, German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Men fell in clusters, cut down before they could even see their enemy. Whittlesey's officers tried to maintain formation, but the terrain made it impossible. Units became separated in the dense undergrowth. Communication between companies broke down. Still, they pushed forward, driven by Whittlesey's determination to follow his orders. By mid-morning, they had advanced several hundred yards and overrun a German position. For a brief moment, it seemed the attack might succeed. Then disaster struck. The units on Whittlesey's flanks, the battalions that were supposed to advance with him and protect his exposed sides, ran into heavy resistance and were forced to fall back. Whittlesey sent runners to the rear, requesting information and support. The runners returned with orders to continue advancing and to hold any ground captured. By late afternoon on October 2nd, Whittlesey's battalion had pushed nearly a kilometer ahead of the main American line. They were in a small valley, surrounded by ridges held by German forces. As darkness fell, Whittlesey realized with cold certainty that the battalion was now isolated deep in enemy territory. The trap was closing. As dawn broke on October 3rd, 1918, the true horror of the situation became apparent to every man in the battalion. German soldiers had moved into positions behind them during the night, completely cutting them off from the American lines. Whittlesey's command now occupied a steep hillside roughly 300 yards long and 60 yards wide, a pocket of American resistance surrounded by enemy forces on all sides. The position was militarily indefensible by any conventional standard, yet retreat was impossible and surrender unthinkable. Whittlesey immediately set about organizing his defenses with the methodical approach of the lawyer he had once been. He positioned his strongest units, the companies of the 308th Infantry, along the perimeter, with machine gun positions covering the most likely avenues of German attack. The wounded were moved to a slight depression in the hillside that offered minimal protection from shell fire. Water became the most critical concern almost immediately. A small stream ran to the bottom of the ravine, but German machine gunners had positioned themselves to cover it. Any man who tried to fill canteens faced almost certain death. The battalion's supplies were woefully inadequate for a prolonged siege. They had advanced expecting to be resupplied within hours, carrying only one day's rations. Ammunition was limited to what each man carried in his cartridge belt, usually about 100 rounds. They had no heavy weapons, no mortars, and only 2 machine guns. Medical supplies consisted of what the battalion surgeon, Captain Feldman, carried in his aid bags, enough to treat minor wounds, but nowhere near sufficient for the carnage that was coming. Communication with headquarters was Whittlesey's first priority. He had brought carrier pigeons with him, standard practice for advancing units in an era before portable radios. On the morning of October 3rd, he sent his first pigeon back with a message reporting his position and requesting immediate support. The pigeon successfully reached headquarters, confirming what commanders already suspected. Whittlesey's battalion was cut off, but knowing where they were and being able to help them were 2 entirely different matters. German forces wasted no time in attempting to annihilate the trapped Americans. Throughout October 3rd, enemy soldiers probed the perimeter, testing for weak points. Machine gun fire raked the American positions at irregular intervals, making any movement above ground suicidal. German artillery observers on the ridges called down shell fire with devastating accuracy. The Americans could only huddle in their shallow foxholes and endure as high explosive shells burst around them, sending red-hot shrapnel screaming through the air. Men were killed or horribly wounded in these barges, their screams echoing through the ravine. By nightfall on October 3rd, the battalion had already suffered significant casualties. Several officers were dead or wounded, including Whittlesey's second-in-command. Captain George McMurtry, a former investment broker and veteran of the Spanish-American War, became Whittlesey's right hand in managing the defense. Where Whittlesey was intellectual and reserved, McMurtry was practical and direct. Together they formed an effective command team that would hold the battalion together through the nightmare to come. The men spent that first night in a state of exhausted terror. German soldiers moved through the forest around them in the darkness, calling out in English to try to draw fire and reveal American positions. "Hey, Yank, you're surrounded. Give up." Some of these voices belonged to German Americans who had returned to Germany before the war and were now fighting for their ancestral homeland. The psychological warfare was effective. Men gripped their rifles in darkness, straining to distinguish real threats from shadows and imagination. Hunger began to gnaw at the soldiers by October 4th. With their rations exhausted, there was literally nothing to eat. Some men tried chewing on leaves or roots, but this provided no sustenance. The water situation became desperate. Men's tongues swelled in their mouths from thirst. A few tried to crawl down to the stream under cover of darkness, but German machine gunners fired at any sound or movement. Some men made it and filled canteens before scrambling back. Others were cut down, their bodies left sprawled at the water's edge as a grim warning to anyone else who might try. Whittlesey sent another pigeon message on October 4th, providing updated coordinates and reporting the battalion's desperate situation. Headquarters responded with promises of relief attacks and supply drops, but none materialized. The relief attacks were repulsed with heavy losses before they could reach the trapped battalion. The men in the pocket could hear the sounds of battle in the distance, the rattle of machine guns and the crump of artillery, and knew that their fellow soldiers were dying in attempts to rescue them. But as each attack failed, hope dimmed a little more. They were truly alone. On October 4th, 1918, as the trapped battalion entered its second full day of siege, salvation seemed to arrive in the form of American artillery. The distinctive whistle of incoming shells prompted initially confused reactions among the exhausted soldiers. Were the Germans shelling them again? But the angle and sound were wrong. These shells were coming from behind the American lines. In horror, Whittlesey and his men realized that their own artillery was firing directly onto their position, and the bombardment was devastatingly accurate. High explosive shells screamed into the ravine, detonating among the foxholes with catastrophic effect. Men who had survived German attacks were now being killed and wounded by American artillery. The shells burst in the trees overhead, sending shrapnel raining down on soldiers who had no protection from above. Soldiers pressed themselves into the rocky soil, trying desperately to dig deeper into foxholes that were already as deep as the terrain allowed. The bombardment continued for hours, systematic and relentless, each explosion adding to the carnage. Whittlesey was frantic. He immediately sent runners to try to reach American lines and stop the artillery fire, but the runners were either killed or driven back by German soldiers who now controlled all routes out of the pocket. He tried sending more pigeon messages, but the birds had difficulty launching from the ravine in the chaos of the bombardment. Panic began to spread among the men. Surviving German attacks was one thing. Soldiers could at least shoot back at visible enemies, but there was no defense against artillery, particularly when it came from their own side. The friendly fire resulted from a catastrophic failure in communication and coordination. American artillery officers, operating from positions miles to the rear, were firing based on outdated maps and incorrect coordinates. They believed they were shelling German positions when in fact they were hitting their own isolated battalion. The battalion's actual position had been reported to headquarters, but this information either didn't reach the artillery units or was disregarded in favor of their pre-planned fire missions. In the fog of war, bureaucratic failures and poor communication were killing American soldiers as effectively as any German attack. By mid-afternoon on October 4th, Whittlesey had only one carrier pigeon remaining. The bird, named Cher Ami, French for dear friend, was the battalion's last hope for communication with headquarters. Whittlesey hastily scribbled a message on a small piece of paper. "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He placed a message in the small aluminum capsule attached to Cher Ami's leg and released the bird. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in military history. Cher Ami launched from Whittlesey's hand and immediately began climbing for altitude, instinctively heading toward his home loft at division headquarters. German soldiers spotted the bird and opened fire with rifles and machine guns. For agonizing seconds, it appeared the pigeon might make it. Then, roughly 30 feet in the air, Cher Ami was hit. The bird faltered and dropped back toward the ground. American soldiers watched in despair, knowing their last hope for communication was about to be lost. But Cher Ami refused to die, despite being severely wounded. Hit in the breast, blinded in one eye, with one leg hanging by a tendon, the pigeon resumed flight. With extraordinary determination, Cher Ami flew 25 miles back to division headquarters in just 25 minutes, arriving bleeding and near death. The message was still intact in the capsule on his mangled leg. Communications officers immediately forwarded Whittlesey's desperate plea to artillery command. The American artillery fire ceased within minutes of Cher Ami's arrival. The sudden silence seemed almost as shocking as the bombardment had been. Men slowly emerged from their foxholes, stunned and shaken. The friendly fire had killed 30 soldiers and wounded many more. Casualties the battalion could ill afford. More devastating than the physical losses was the psychological impact. The men had endured German attacks with grim determination, sustained by the belief that their own army was trying to rescue them. The friendly fire shattered that faith. If their own artillery could kill them, perhaps headquarters didn't know or care about their situation. Morale, already low, plummeted further. Cher Ami survived his injuries and became a celebrated hero. Army medics saved his life through emergency surgery, though they couldn't save his shattered leg. The pigeon was later fitted with a tiny wooden leg and became a symbol of courage and determination. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for his heroic service. Cher Ami lived less than a year after his famous flight, succumbing to his wounds in June 1919. His body was preserved and is now displayed at the Smithsonian Institution, where visitors can still see this tiny hero who saved a lost battalion. On October 5th and 6th, as the siege entered its 4th and 5th days, the situation in the pocket deteriorated catastrophically. Nearly a third of the battalion was now dead or wounded. The The surviving soldiers were hollow-eyed with exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Many had not slept for 72 hours or more. Water remained almost impossible to obtain. Men's lips cracked and bled from dehydration. The wounded suffered terribly, their groans and cries echoing to the ravine day and night. Captain Feldman, the battalion surgeon, did what he could with dwindling medical supplies. But men were dying from wounds that would have been treatable with proper facilities. German attacks intensified on October 5th. Enemy soldiers launched coordinated assaults on the American perimeter, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to stretch the defenders thin. The Americans, despite their desperate condition, fought back with rifles, grenades, and sheer desperation. Machine gunner Private Hollinghead held his position for hours, firing control bursts at attacking Germans until his ammunition was exhausted and he was killed by return fire. Lieutenant Peabody led a counterattack with fixed bayonets that drove back a German penetration, though he was severely wounded in the process. The German commanders recognized that the trapped Americans were weakening. Rather than waste more men in direct assaults, they decided to try a different approach. On the morning of October 6th, an eerie silence settled over the pocket. No machine gun fire, no artillery, just an uncanny quiet that made the American soldiers more nervous than the attacks had. Then, around mid-morning, movement was spotted along the perimeter. A German soldier appeared, carrying a white flag. The German soldier was Private Lowell R. Hollingshead of Company K, an American who had been captured during a patrol the previous day. He was being used as an envoy, forced to carry a message from the German commander to Major Whittlesey. Under guard, Hollingshead made his way to where Whittlesey and McMurtry had established their command post. He handed over a written message, typed in English on a small piece of paper. The message was direct and formal. To the commanding officer of the American forces, the bearer of this is a soldier of your forces captured by us. He refused to give us the German password and has been severely wounded. We should like to give him the same treatment as our own wounded. But if you will permit it, we are prepared to give back this soldier on condition that you surrender. Think this matter over. If not, it will be necessary for us to annihilate you. The message was signed by a German officer and represented a formal surrender demand. Under the customs of war at that time, such demands were not uncommon when a surrounded force faced hopeless odds. The German commander was offering Whittlesey the opportunity to save his remaining men from further suffering and death by surrendering with honor. Given the battalion's desperate condition, starving, dehydrated, low on ammunition, with no relief in sight, it was arguably a reasonable offer. Whittlesey read the message without expression, then looked up at Hollingshead. "Is that all?" he asked. Hollingshead nodded. Whittlesey folded the paper and placed it in his pocket without another word. He never formally responded to the German surrender demand, neither accepting nor rejecting it. His silence was his answer. Years later, when asked about this moment, Whittlesey would say only that he had orders to hold his position, and he intended to follow those orders regardless of the consequences. McMurtry supported Whittlesey's decision immediately and without reservation. Together they made sure every officer and NCO in the battalion understood. There would be no surrender. The men would hold their position or die trying. When word of the German surrender, demand spread to the ranks. Reactions varied. Some men felt a surge of defiant pride. The Germans thought they were beaten and they'd prove them wrong. Others simply felt resignation. Surrender might mean survival, but it also meant captivity in German prison camps where conditions were reportedly brutal. At least fighting gave them some control over their fate. The German response to Whittlesey's silence was swift and brutal. Artillery fire resumed with increased intensity, pounding the American positions hour after hour. German infantry launched a major assault that afternoon, attacking from three sides simultaneously. The fighting devolved into close-quarter savagery, rifles fired at point-blank range, grenades thrown into foxholes, hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and entrenching tools. The Americans, despite being weakened by days of siege, fought with desperate fury. They knew that if German soldiers overran their positions, wounded men would be killed where they lay. The attack was finally repulsed, but at terrible cost. More Americans were dead or wounded, ammunition supplies were dangerously low, and morale wavered on the edge of collapse. Some men began to question whether Whittlesey's refusal to surrender had been the right decision. Wouldn't it be better to live as prisoners and die for a piece of worthless forest? But Whittlesey never showed doubt or hesitation. His iron will and absolute determination to follow orders, to hold a position no matter what, became the glue that held the battalion together. If their commander wouldn't give up, then neither would they. As October 6th turned to night, the fifth night of the siege, the men of the Lost Battalion faced what might be their last darkness. Relief attacks had failed. Supplies hadn't reached them. They were starving, parched with thirst, running out of ammunition, and surrounded by an enemy determined to destroy them. Yet they endured, sustained by a stubborn refusal to quit that defied all rational calculation. Whittlesey's decision to ignore the German surrender demand had committed them to fight to the end. Now they would discover whether that end meant rescue or annihilation. While Whittlesey's battalion suffered in their isolated pocket, American commanders frantically organized rescue attempts. Division headquarters was painfully aware that several hundred soldiers were trapped and facing destruction, and the press had begun reporting on the Lost Battalion, creating public pressure to save them. General Alexander ordered multiple relief attacks, committing thousands of troops to break through German lines and reach the surrounded men. Each attempt cost hundreds of casualties and achieved nothing. The first major relief effort launched on October 4th. 2 battalions attacked toward Whittlesey's position, advancing to the same deadly forest that had trapped the original force. German defenders, firmly entrenched in prepared positions, cut down the attackers with machine gun and artillery fire. The assault gained barely 100 yards before being forced to withdraw, leaving the ground littered with American dead and wounded. Whittlesey's men, hearing the battle sounds in the distance, felt hope briefly surge before fading again when no relief appeared. A second relief attack on October 5th met similar results. This time, American commanders tried a different approach, attempting to outflank German positions rather than attack directly. But the terrain made flanking maneuvers nearly impossible, and German forces had established defensive positions covering all likely approaches. The attack stalled within hours, and surviving American soldiers withdrew under covering fire, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead behind. The Germans maintained their iron grip on the forest, and Whittlesey's battalion remained cut off. American artillery attempted to support rescue efforts by bombarding German positions, but with limited success. The forest terrain made artillery fire less effective. Shells that hit trees exploded in the canopy, and the broken ground provided cover from shrapnel. Moreover, American artillery officers were terrified of hitting their own trapped battalion again, making them overly cautious in targeting areas near the pocket. German soldiers quickly learned that they could operate relatively safely in zones close to American positions because American artillery wouldn't risk firing there. Airdrops were attempted to resupply the trapped battalion. American aircraft flew over the pocket and dropped packages containing food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The air crews risked German anti-aircraft fire to make these drops, and several aircraft were damaged or shot down. But the drops were largely unsuccessful. The dense forest canopy caught most packages, leaving them hanging in trees where soldiers couldn't reach them. Other packages landed outside the American perimeter in German-controlled territory. A few drops landed within the pocket, but the quantities were insufficient to make a significant difference. The men watched desperately as supplies dangled in tree branches just yards away, completely unreachable. By October 6th, General Alexander was under enormous pressure to rescue the trapped battalion. Newspaper reports had made the Lost Battalion a cause célèbre, and the American public demanded action. The War Department in Washington sent increasingly urgent messages asking about the situation. Alexander ordered yet another relief attack for October 7th, this time committing even more troops and artillery support. But divisional staff officers were pessimistic about success. The German defenses were simply too strong, and every attack suffered crippling casualties before reaching Whittlesey's position. Unknown to American commanders, events were developing elsewhere that would ultimately save the Lost Battalion. American and French forces attacking in other sectors of the Meuse-Argonne offensive were making progress, gradually pushing German lines back. The German High Command began to recognize that their positions in the Argonne Forest were becoming untenable. If they remain in the forest while Allied forces advance around them, German units risked being cut off and surrounded themselves. Orders began circulating at German headquarters to prepare for a general withdrawal from the Argonne sector. But none of this was known to Whittlesey's men on October 6th and early October 7th. As far as they knew, relief attempts had failed, and they were going to die in this godforsaken forest. Ammunition was critically low. Many soldiers had fewer than 10 rounds remaining. Food was completely exhausted. Water could only be obtained by risking death at the stream. The wounded were dying from lack of proper medical care. Men began hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion. Some simply stopped responding, staring blankly at nothing, their minds breaking under the strain. Whittlesey and McMurtry maintained discipline through sheer force of will. They moved constantly among the foxholes, checking on men, offering encouragement, ensuring that lookouts remained alert despite exhaustion. Both officers were as hungry and thirsty as their men, but they showed no weakness. When soldiers asked when relief arrived, Whittlesey gave the same answer. Soon. Hold on a little longer. He had no reason to believe this was true, but hope was the only thing keeping men alive at this point. If they lost hope, the battalion would disintegrate. On the morning of October 7th, the 6th day of siege, American artillery began a massive bombardment of German positions around the pocket. The intensity of fire suggested that another relief attack was imminent. The trapped soldiers prepared themselves. If American forces broke through, they would need to be ready to fight their way out to link up with rescuers. Men checked their weapons and counted their remaining ammunition. Some had as few as 5 rounds left. They fixed bayonets, knowing that if Germans counterattacked, it would come down to hand-to-hand fighting. The men of the Lost Battalion braced for what they believed would be their final battle. Among the many horrifying aspects of the Lost Battalion siege, one of the most disturbing was the fate of the men who simply vanished. When the final count was made after rescue, official records listed 107 men killed in action, 190 wounded, and 63 missing. That last number, 63 missing, represented men who disappeared without explanation during the 6-day siege. Some of these missing soldiers were undoubtedly killed by artillery fire that obliterated their bodies, but others vanished under mysterious circumstances that have never been fully explained. The chaotic nature of the siege made it difficult to maintain accurate accountability. Companies were scattered across the pocket, often out of visual contact with each other. During German attacks, soldiers moved between positions to reinforce threatened areas. At night, in complete darkness, it was impossible to track individuals. Officers tried to maintain rosters, but exhaustion in combat made this nearly impossible. Men would be present during one roll call and absent the next, with no clear explanation of what happened to them. Some soldiers attempted to break out of the pocket on their own initiative. Driven to desperation by hunger, thirst, or wounds, these men tried to slip through German lines under cover of darkness. A few may have succeeded. There were later unconfirmed reports of individual soldiers from battalions straggling back to American lines days after the rescue. But most who attempted escape were almost certainly killed or captured by German soldiers who maintained close watch on the perimeter. Their bodies, if they fell in German-controlled areas, were never recovered. German soldiers did capture some Americans during the siege. We know this because Private Hollingshead was captured and later used to deliver the surrender demand. Other soldiers who went to the stream for water or who were wounded and unable to move may have been captured when German forces overran their positions. Some of these prisoners may have survived the war in German POW camps and returned home after the armistice. Others likely died in captivity. German POW camps in 1918 were experiencing severe food shortages, and wounded prisoners often received inadequate medical care. The most disturbing theories about the missing soldiers involved possible executions. There were later allegations that some German soldiers killed American prisoners rather than evacuating them to the rear. This would have been a war crime under international law, but such violations occurred on all sides during World War I. The Argonne Forest fighting was particularly brutal, and soldiers in that hellish environment sometimes committed atrocities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. However, no definitive evidence of prisoner executions was ever established, and such allegations must be treated with caution. Artillery fire from both sides undoubtedly accounted for many of the missing. High explosive shells could literally disintegrate human bodies, leaving no remains to identify. The friendly fire incident on October 4th alone may have accounted for numerous missing soldiers whose bodies were obliterated by American artillery. German artillery fired thousands of shells into the pocket over 6 days, and each direct hit could erase all trace of a man's existence. After the rescue, American burial details found scattered body parts and blood stains, but often no complete remains that could be identified. The terrain itself may have claimed victims. The ravine contained numerous crevices, sinkholes, and thick patches of undergrowth where a wounded or disoriented soldier could disappear. Men suffering from shock, blood loss, or dehydration might have wandered away from the perimeter and collapsed in the forest, their bodies never found. Decades after the war, hikers and researchers occasionally discovered skeletal remains and military artifacts in the Argonne Forest, silent testimony to soldiers who died alone in that wilderness. Medical officers face impossible situations during the siege. Captain Feldman and his medics treated hundreds of wounded with minimal supplies and no ability to evacuate the seriously injured. Some soldiers may have been listed as missing when they actually died of wounds, but their deaths weren't recorded due to the chaos. Bodies may have been temporarily buried in shallow graves within the perimeter, and the locations forgotten or lost when the battalion was finally relieved. The condition of men rescued on October 7th suggested that some recorded as missing had likely died and been buried by their comrades, who then couldn't remember exact locations. Psychological casualties may also explain some disappearances. The extreme stress of the siege, constant danger, hunger, thirst, sleep deprivation, the screams of wounded men, caused mental breakdowns in some soldiers. In World War I, this was called shell shock and is now recognized as severe PTSD. Some soldiers simply stopped functioning, becoming catatonic or wandering aimlessly. In the chaos of siege, such individuals might have wandered away from their positions and been killed, captured, or died of exposure without anyone noticing until later. The mystery of the missing soldiers haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Men would remember a comrade fighting beside them one moment and gone the next, with no knowledge of his fate. Was he killed? Captured? Did he escape? The not knowing was torturous for survivors, and even worse for families back home. Many families never learned what happened to their sons or husbands. The official notification simply listed them as missing in action, a bureaucratic phrase that provided no closure and offered no peace. After the war, efforts were made to recover and identify remains from the battlefield. Graves registration units searched the Argonne Forest, finding and repatriating many American dead. But the forest was vast, the terrain difficult, and many bodies were never found. To this day, the exact fate of all 63 men listed as missing from the Lost Battalion remains unknown. They are among the thousands of American soldiers from World War I who have no known graves, commemorated only on memorials to the missing. Their disappearance remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Great War. The morning of October 7th, 1918, began like the 5 previous mornings, with hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and the expectation of more German attacks. The men of the Lost Battalion had now survived 6 days of siege. They were skeletons of their former selves, hollow-eyed and emaciated. Many had not eaten for 4 days. Water intake had been minimal and sporadic. The wounded lay in rows, groaning in agony, their bandages filthy and unchanged for days. The stench of blood, gangrene, and human waste permeated the pocket. By any rational assessment, the battalion was finished as an effective fighting force. Yet Whittlesey and McMurtry maintained the defense. Officers made their rounds of perimeter, ensuring that lookouts remained alert. Ammunition was redistributed, with rounds taken from dead soldiers and given to those still able to fight. Men checked their weapons with mechanical precision, too exhausted for conversation. Some men prayed quietly. Others simply stared into the forest, waiting for whatever came next. The prevailing mood was one of grim resignation. If this was the day they died, so be it, but they would die fighting. Around mid-morning, soldiers noticed something unusual. The German artillery fire, which had been relentless for days, was decreasing in intensity. Machine gun fire from German positions became sporadic rather than constant. At first, the Americans assumed this was a prelude to another infantry assault. The Germans would cease fire, then attack under cover of the resulting silence. Men gripped their rifles tighter, preparing for what might be the final assault that would overrun their positions. But no attack came. The silence stretched on, minutes turning to an hour. Whittlesey sent out scouts to cautiously probe the perimeter, expecting them to draw immediate fire. The scouts crept forward through the undergrowth, certain that German machine guns would open up at any moment, but there was no fire. The scouts pushed further, moving into areas that had been German strong points just hours before. The positions were abandoned. Equipment, supplies, even some weapons had been left behind in what appeared to be a hasty withdrawal. The realization spread slowly through the battalion. The Germans were pulling back. After 6 days of siege, the enemy that had seemed determined to annihilate them was withdrawing from the sector. Men emerged from their foxholes cautiously, hardly believing their ordeal might be ending. Some began moving toward the stream, that cursed stream that had been covered by German fire for days, and found they could fill canteens without being shot. The first taste of water after days of dehydration was almost painful as parched throats tried to swallow. What the trapped soldiers didn't know was that the German withdrawal resulted from strategic necessity rather than American tactical success. Allied advances in other sectors had made the German position in the Argonne untenable. German commanders ordered a general withdrawal to new defensive lines further to the rear. The decision had nothing to do with the Lost Battalion specifically. They were simply one small element in a much larger battlefield picture. But for Whittlesey's men, the reason didn't matter. The Germans were leaving, and they had survived. American relief forces, which had been battering against German defenses for days, suddenly found resistance collapsing. Units that had been stopped cold just hours before now advanced rapidly through the forest. By early afternoon on October 7th, lead elements of the relief column reached the perimeter of Whittlesey's position. The first American soldiers to break through were shocked by what they found. The men they were rescuing barely looked human, filthy, emaciated, many wounded, all bearing the 1,000-yard stare of men who had looked into the abyss. Captain Edward Grant, a former professional baseball player serving as a company commander in the relief force, was one of the first officers to reach Whittlesey. "How are you, Major?" he asked. Whittlesey's reply was characteristic. "We've had a rather difficult time." The massive understatement couldn't hide the toll the siege had taken. Whittlesey himself had lost considerable weight and looked decades older than his 34 years. But he remained in command, immediately coordinating with relief forces to begin evacuating his wounded and accounting for his men. The evacuation of the Lost Battalion took several hours. Medical personnel rushed forward with stretchers to carry the wounded. The more seriously injured were treated on site, then carefully carried back to the forest to aid stations in the rear. Soldiers who could walk, and many insisted on walking even though they could barely stand, began the slow journey out of the pocket that had been their hell for 6 days. Relief forces provided food and water, though medics had to ration both carefully since starving men who ate too much too quickly could suffer serious medical consequences. As the evacuation proceeded, the scale of the battalion's losses became clear. Of approximately 554 men who had entered the pocket on October 2nd, only about 194 emerged unscathed. 107 were confirmed dead, though many bodies remained unrecovered in the forest. 190 were wounded, some so severely they would never fully recover. 63 were missing and would never be accounted for. The battalion had suffered nearly 70% casualties, a level of loss that would normally indicate total unit destruction. Yet they had held their position and maintained organizational integrity throughout the ordeal. News of the Lost Battalion's rescue spread rapidly. Newspapers across America trumpeted the story. Isolated American soldiers, surrounded by Germans, low on everything, yet refusing to surrender and ultimately rescued. The story had everything the public wanted: courage, determination, suffering, and ultimate triumph. Whittlesey and his men became instant celebrities, though most of the survivors felt no sense of triumph, only exhaustion and grief for their lost comrades. They had survived, but at a cost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The immediate aftermath of the rescue was controlled chaos. Survivors were evacuated to field hospitals behind the lines, where medical staff struggled to treat hundreds of cases of dehydration, starvation, wounds, and shock. The seriously wounded were stabilized and sent to rear area hospitals or evacuated to England. Men who could be returned to duty after treatment were given medical care, food, rest, and clean uniforms. But no amount of physical care could address the psychological trauma they had endured. The Lost Battalion designation, which had begun as a newspaper creation, was now cemented in American military history. The unit's official designation remained the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment, 77th Division, but everyone called them the Lost Battalion. The name was somewhat ironic. The battalion had never been lost in the sense that headquarters didn't know where they were. They had been isolated and surrounded, but not lost. Nevertheless, the nickname stuck and would follow the survivors forever. Awards and decorations followed quickly. Major Charles Whittlesey received the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his leadership during the siege. Captain George McMurtry also received the Medal of Honor. Other officers and enlisted men received Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, and other decorations recognizing their courage and sacrifice. The citations described acts of heroism: machine gunners who held their positions until killed, medics who treated wounded under fire, soldiers who volunteered for suicidal missions to get water or carry messages. Public celebrations greeted the survivors when they returned to the United States after the armistice. New York City held a massive parade for the 77th Division, with Whittlesey and other Lost Battalion veterans given places of honor. Crowds cheered, bands played, and politicians made speeches about American heroism and determination. The survivors were treated as heroes, their faces appearing in newspapers across the country. For many of these men, who had been ordinary citizens just months before, the sudden fame was overwhelming and unwelcome. But beneath the celebrations and medals lay profound trauma. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not well understood in 1918. The term shell shock was used to describe soldiers who suffered psychological breakdowns, but there was little effective treatment and considerable stigma attached to mental health issues. Soldiers were expected to simply get over it and return to normal civilian life. For the Lost Battalion survivors, this proved impossible. Many veterans reported recurring nightmares about the siege. They would wake screaming, reliving the artillery barges, the screams of wounded comrades, the desperate thirst and hunger. Some became unable to tolerate loud noises, which triggered flashbacks to combat. Others developed severe anxiety, depression, or turned to alcohol to numb their psychological pain. Family members struggled to understand why their loved ones, who had come home physically intact, seemed like different people, distant, troubled, unable to connect emotionally. Survivors formed the Lost Battalion Survivors Association in the 1920s and continued meeting for decades afterward. These gatherings served multiple purposes: commemorating fallen comrades, maintaining bonds forged in combat, and providing mutual support among men who share experiences that outsiders could never fully understand. At these reunions, veterans could speak honestly about the siege without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. They remembered not just the heroism, but also the horror, the things they had seen and done that haunted them decades later. The physical toll on survivors was also severe. Men who had survived the siege often carried lasting injuries, wounds that never fully healed, chronic pain, disabilities that affected their ability to work. Some had lost limbs or suffered disfiguring injuries. Others developed health problems later attributed to the extreme stress and deprivation they had endured. Many veterans died young, their bodies worn out by the ordeal they had survived. The families of the dead and missing faced their own agonies. Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in the war, sought information about how their boys had died, wanted to know if they had suffered, if they had been brave, if their sacrifice had meaning. Many approached Whittlesey at public events or wrote him letters asking for details. He tried to respond to each inquiry, but doing so meant reliving the siege repeatedly, describing deaths he had witnessed or commanded men into. The burden became crushing. Financial problems plagued some survivors. Soldiers received little compensation for their service, and disability payments were often inadequate. Widows of fallen soldiers struggled to support families on meager pensions. Some reached out to Whittlesey and other officers for financial assistance, believing that the famous heroes had resources to help. Whittlesey, always dutiful, helped when he could, but the constant requests weighed on him emotionally and financially. The Lost Battalion became a symbol that carried both pride and burden. Americans wanted to celebrate the story as an example of courage and determination, qualities the nation valued. But this celebration often glossed over the horrific reality of what the men had endured and the questionable decisions that had led to their isolation. Some veterans resented the way their suffering had been packaged into a neat patriotic narrative that ignored the incompetence of commanders who had sent them into an impossible situation and failed to support them adequately. Controversy surrounded some aspects of the Lost Battalion story in the years after the war. Critics questioned whether Whittlesey should have retreated when he realized his position was untenable, potentially saving lives. Others argued that strict adherence to orders, even suicidal orders, represented the kind of military discipline that won wars. These debates troubled Whittlesey deeply, as he questioned his own decisions and wondered if he could have done more to save the men who died under his command. The question of the missing soldiers haunted survivors and families for decades. Without bodies to bury or confirmed information about what happened, families couldn't achieve closure. Some held out hope that missing soldiers might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or held in unknown prison camps. But as years passed and men didn't return, hope faded into resigned grief. The 63 men listed as missing from the Lost Battalion became part of the larger tragedy of the Great War's missing. Tens of thousands of soldiers whose remains were never identified or recovered. 3 years after the siege that made him famous, Charles Whittlesey boarded the SS Toloy in New York Harbor on November 26, 1921. Bound for Havana, Cuba, he had been invited to serve as a pallbearer at the burial of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery just weeks earlier, a prestigious honor recognizing his status as one of America's most celebrated war heroes. But the ceremony, rather than providing closure, had intensified the psychological torment that had plagued him since the Argonne Forest. The unknown soldier's funeral affected Whittlesey profoundly. Standing at Arlington as the unidentified remains of an American soldier were interred with full military honors, Whittlesey couldn't help but think of the men he had commanded who lay in unmarked graves in France or were listed simply as missing. The ceremony was meant to honor all the fallen, but for Whittlesey it became a reminder of every soldier who had died under his command, every man whose face he remembered, whose death he had witnessed or ordered. Since returning from France in 1919, Whittlesey had struggled to readjust to civilian life. He resumed his law practice in New York, returning to the corporate legal work that had occupied him before the war. Outwardly, he appeared successful, still a partner in a prestigious firm, financially comfortable, respected in his profession. But those close to him recognized that something fundamental had broken inside him during those 6 days in the Argonne. Friends and colleagues reported that Whittlesey suffered from severe insomnia and nightmares. When he did sleep, he would wake screaming, reliving the siege. He became withdrawn and distant, unable to engage emotionally with others. The gregarious social life he had enjoyed before the war disappeared. He avoided gatherings and seemed uncomfortable in crowds. His weight dropped as he ate irregularly and showed little interest in food. All of these were classic symptoms of what we now recognize as severe PTSD, but in 1921 there was little understanding or effective treatment available. The constant public attention made everything worse. Whittlesey couldn't escape his fame. Newspapers regularly featured stories about the Lost Battalion, keeping the memories fresh. He was invited to speak at military events, veterans gatherings, and patriotic ceremonies, invitations he felt obligated to accept despite how painful they were. Each speech meant reliving the siege publicly, describing events that haunted him privately. He was trapped in his identity as a hero of the Lost Battalion, unable to move forward with his life. Most torturous were the encounters with families of fallen soldiers. Widows, mothers, fathers, and siblings sought him out, wanted to know about their loved ones' final moments. Had their son died bravely? Did he suffer? What were his last words? Whittlesey tried to provide comfort, but how could he tell a mother that her son had died screaming from a gut wound, or had been obliterated by an artillery shell, or had simply vanished without a trace? He carried the weight of hundreds of deaths, and families kept adding to that burden by seeking answers he couldn't provide without causing more pain. Some families asked Whittlesey for financial assistance. Widows with children struggled to survive on inadequate military pensions. Disabled veterans needed help with medical expenses. Whittlesey, with his lawyer's income and public profile, seemed like someone who could help. He gave what he could, but the requests were constant and the needs overwhelming. He felt responsible for these people. If he had made different decisions in the Argonne, perhaps their husbands or sons would still be alive. Critics and second-guessers added to Whittlesey's psychological burden. Some military analysts argued that he should have retreated when his flanks collapsed, that his rigid adherence to orders had unnecessarily cost lives. Others defended his actions, but in doing so emphasized the casualties, keeping the losses at the forefront of public discussion. Whittlesey internalized all of this criticism, constantly questioning whether he made the right decisions, whether he could have saved more men. By November 1921, Whittlesey was in crisis. The unknown soldier ceremony had been emotionally devastating. His law practice no longer provided meaning or distraction. The nightmares and insomnia were getting worse. Friends noticed his increasing depression, but felt powerless to help. There was no effective treatment for what we now call PTSD, and the stigma around mental health issues meant that seeking help would have been seen as weakness, unacceptable for a Medal of Honor recipient and war hero. On November 26, 1921, Whittlesey boarded the SS Tolo for what was supposed to be a vacation cruise to Cuba. Perhaps he hoped that getting away from New York and the constant reminders of the war would provide relief. That first evening aboard ship, he joined the captain and another passenger, also a war veteran, in the ship's lounge. For the first time in 3 years, witnesses reported Whittlesey seemed to relax. He talked openly about his experiences in France, something he rarely did. He laughed, drank, and appeared to be enjoying himself. Around 11 p.m., Whittlesey excused himself, telling the others he was going to his cabin to sleep. The captain later noted that Whittlesey seemed in good spirits when he left. But Whittlesey never reached his cabin. At some point after leaving the lounge, he walked to the ship's deck and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. No one witnessed the act. He was simply gone. When Whittlesey failed to appear for breakfast the next morning, a search of the ship was conducted. His cabin was empty, his belongings undisturbed. No suicide note was found. Investigators later theorized that the evening in the lounge, where Whittlesey finally spoke freely about the war, had been a kind of unburdening before he took his life. Perhaps talking about the Argonne had made the memories too vivid to bear any longer. Or perhaps he had already made the decision to die and allowed himself one final night of human connection before carrying out. Whittlesey's body was never recovered. He disappeared into the ocean as completely as some of his men had disappeared in the Argonne Forest. News of his death shocked the nation. Newspapers that had celebrated him as a hero now struggled to explain his suicide. Some attributed it to overwork or physical illness, uncomfortable acknowledging that America's war heroes could be psychologically destroyed by their experiences. Others recognized the truth, that Whittlesey had been a casualty of the war just as surely as the men who died in the Argonne, his death simply delayed by 3 years. A memorial service was held in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, attended by approximately 3,000 mourners. Veterans of the Lost Battalion came to pay their respects to the commander who had led them through hell and never forgiven himself for the price paid. The service was somber, marked by the understanding that Whittlesey's death was not just a personal tragedy, but a symptom of a larger crisis, the psychological toll of war on those who survived combat. Whittlesey's suicide highlighted the invisible wounds of war that society was ill-equipped to address. His death raised uncomfortable questions about the cost of heroism and the long-term impact of combat trauma. But in 1921, these questions had no good answers. Mental health treatment was primitive, and veterans were expected to simply move on from their wartime experiences. The idea that someone as educated, successful, and celebrated as Whittlesey could be broken by war-challenged assumptions about courage, strength, and recovery that society wasn't ready to abandon. Charles Whittlesey was 37 years old when he died. He never married, never found peace after the war, and carried the weight of command decisions until it became unbearable. His death was the last casualty of the Lost Battalion siege, a delayed fatality that illustrated how war's damage extends far beyond the battlefield and can destroy survivors years after the guns fall silent. Among all the heroes of the Lost Battalion saga, perhaps the most unlikely was a small homing pigeon named Cher Ami. This bird, weighing less than a pound and standing only about 10 inches tall, would accomplish what human runners could not: deliver a desperate message through enemy fire that would save the lives of nearly 200 American soldiers. Cher Ami's story became one of the most famous animal tales of World War I and remains an inspiration over a century later. Homing pigeons were crucial communication tools during World War I. In an era before portable radios, armies relied on pigeons to carry messages between frontline units and headquarters. These birds possess an extraordinary ability to navigate back to their home loft from distances of up to 100 miles, flying at speeds of 50 to 60 miles per hour. The U.S. Army Signal Corps maintained thousands of pigeons in France, training them and deploying them with advancing units. Cher Ami was one of 600 pigeons donated by British pigeon fanciers to the American Expeditionary Force. The name Cher Ami means dear friend in French and proved prophetic. The pigeon was a blue check-cocked bird with a distinctively marked breast, characteristics that would later help identify him among other pigeons. Before the Lost Battalion incident, Cher Ami had already successfully delivered 11 messages for the American forces, proving his reliability and courage. But nothing in his previous service would compare to his most famous mission. When Major Whittlesey released Cher Ami on the afternoon of October 4th, 1918, the situation was desperate. American artillery was killing and wounding the trapped soldiers, and all other means of communication had failed. This was Whittlesey's last pigeon. If Cher Ami didn't make it through, the artillery bombardment would continue until the battalion was destroyed. The message attached to the bird's leg was brief but urgent. We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The moment Cher Ami launched from the ravine, German soldiers spotted him. They immediately recognized that the pigeon was carrying a message and opened fire with rifles and machine guns. Tracer fire streaked through the air as dozens of German soldiers tried to shoot down this small, fast-moving target. The sound of gunfire was intense. American soldiers in the pocket watched in horror, knowing that their last hope for stopping the friendly fire was under attack. Cher Ami climbed rapidly, instinctively seeking altitude before beginning his 25-mile flight to division headquarters. Then, at approximately 30 feet above the ground, German fire struck him. The pigeon jerked in midair, faltered, and began to fall back toward the ravine. American soldiers watching from their foxholes felt despair wash over them. The bird was hit. Their message would never reach headquarters, and the artillery would continue killing them. But Cher Ami refused to fall. Despite being severely wounded, shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, with one leg hanging by a single tendon and the message capsule still attached, the pigeon somehow recovered and resumed flight. Witnesses later described it as almost miraculous. By all logic, the bird should have died or crashed. Instead, driven by training and instinct, Cher Ami continued flying toward his home loft at division headquarters. The flight took 25 minutes to cover 25 miles. Cher Ami flew through pain, blood loss, and failing vision, navigating across terrain covered with shell holes, trenches, and destroyed forests. When he finally arrived at the division headquarters loft, he was barely alive. The pigeon was covered in blood, one eye destroyed, one leg shattered, and hanging by a thread of tissue. But the message capsule was still attached to the mangled leg, and the message inside was intact. Signal Corps personnel immediately retrieved the message and forwarded it to Artillery Command. Within minutes, orders went out to cease fire on the coordinates Whittlesey had provided. The American artillery bombardment of the Lost Battalion's position stopped, ending the deadly friendly fire incident that had killed 30 soldiers and wounded many more. Cher Ami had succeeded in his mission, saving the lives of the remaining men in the pocket. Army medics rushed to save Cher Ami's life. They performed emergency surgery, treating his chest wound and attempting to save his shattered leg. Despite their efforts, the leg could not be saved and had to be amputated. Army veterinarians fashioned a tiny wooden leg to replace it, creating what may have been one of the first prosthetic limbs made for an animal. Sher Ami survived the surgery and recuperated under careful medical supervision. The pigeon's heroism was immediately recognized. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, personally thanked Sher Ami. The French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military honors. American newspapers published stories about the brave pigeon who had saved the Lost Battalion, and Sher Ami became a national celebrity. His story resonated with the public. Here was a small, fragile creature that had accomplished what seemed impossible, displaying courage that matched any human soldier. After recovering from his wounds, Sher Ami was sent back to the United States in 1919. He was placed in the care of the Signal Corps and became something of a mascot and public relations symbol. The pigeon with his wooden leg and scarred body was exhibited at events and celebrations, a living reminder of courage and sacrifice. Children were particularly fascinated by Sher Ami, and his story was told in schools across America as an example of determination and duty. Tragically, Sher Ami's survival was relatively brief. The wounds he had sustained proved ultimately fatal. On June 13, 1919, less than 8 months after his famous flight, Sher Ami died from complications related to his injuries. He was only about 1 year old, young for a pigeon, which can typically live 10 to 15 years. The war had claimed another victim, though this one had feathers instead of a uniform. Rather than being forgotten, Sher Ami was preserved for posterity. Taxidermists carefully mounted the pigeon's body, ensuring that his wooden leg and visible wounds were preserved. The mounted Sher Ami was placed in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., where he remains on display to this day. Millions of visitors have seen this small hero standing in his display case, a tangible connection to the Lost Battalion story and a reminder of the many forms courage can take. Sher Ami's legacy extends beyond his individual story. His mission highlighted the crucial role that animals played in World War I. Horses, dogs, pigeons, and other creatures served alongside human soldiers and often paid the same ultimate price. An estimated 100,000 pigeons served in World War I, and many thousands were killed or wounded carrying messages through combat zones. Sher Ami became the symbol for all of these animal heroes. The pigeon story also raises profound questions about courage and sacrifice. Sher Ami didn't choose to fly that mission. He was following training and instinct rather than making a conscious decision to risk his life. Yet his refusal to quit after being wounded, his determination to complete the flight despite terrible injuries, suggests something beyond mere training. Whether we call it courage, determination, or simply the will to survive, Sher Ami displayed qualities that humans recognize and admire. Today, over a century after his famous flight, Sher Ami remains one of the most celebrated animals in military history. His story is taught in schools, featured in books and films, and commemorated in museums. The small pigeon who flew through enemy fire with a desperate message has become an enduring symbol of heroism, proof that courage comes in all sizes, and that even the smallest among us can make a difference when circumstances demand it. The Lost Battalion incident, while celebrated as a story of heroism and survival, was also a case study in military failure at multiple levels. The siege resulted from poor planning, inadequate intelligence, failures in command and control, and a fundamental disconnect between officers at headquarters and the reality of combat conditions. Examining these failures provides crucial lessons about military leadership and the fog of war. The root cause of the disaster was the Meuse-Argonne offensive's overall strategy. American commanders, eager to demonstrate that the rapidly expanding U.S. Army could conduct major operations, planned an ambitious offensive through some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The Argonne Forest had been fortified by German forces for 4 years, yet American intelligence significantly underestimated the strength and quality of German defenses. This intelligence failure set the stage for everything that followed. Division Commander Major General Robert Alexander bears significant responsibility for the Lost Battalion's predicament. Alexander was aggressive to the point of recklessness, demanding that his units advance regardless of conditions or casualties. He dismissed reports from frontline commanders about the difficulty of the terrain and the strength of German resistance. When Whittlesey and other battalion commanders expressed concerns about advancing without flank support, Alexander insisted that they push forward anyway. His attitude reflected a broader problem in World War I. Senior commanders operating from headquarters miles behind the lines, making decisions based on maps rather than battlefield reality. The coordination failures were catastrophic. The plan called for multiple battalions to advance on a broad front, maintaining contact with each other and supporting their flanks. But the Argonne Forest made this coordination impossible. Units became separated in the dense undergrowth. Communication broke down as telephone lines were cut by artillery, and runners were killed or lost trying to navigate through the forest. Different battalions advanced at different rates, creating gaps in the line that German forces exploited. Whittlesey's battalion pushed furthest forward, but the units on his flanks failed to keep pace, leaving him exposed. Communication technology of 1918 was completely inadequate for the conditions. Field telephones required physical wires that were constantly cut by artillery fire or destroyed by advancing and retreating troops. Radio technology existed, but was too heavy and unreliable for infantry use. Runner carrying messages on foot were slow and often killed before delivering their messages. Carrier pigeons, while useful, had obvious limitations. They could only carry brief messages one way and were vulnerable to enemy fire and weather. The result was that once Whittlesey's battalion advanced into enemy territory, it became effectively isolated with no reliable means of communication. The friendly fire incident exemplified the dangers of poor communication and coordination. American artillery officers, working from outdated maps and incorrect coordinates, fired on their own troops for hours before Sher Army's message finally stopped the bombardment. This wasn't simply bad luck. It reflected systematic failures in how artillery support was coordinated with infantry advances. Fire control procedures were inadequate. Communication between artillery batteries and frontline units was poor, and there was insufficient verification of target coordinates before firing. The result was 30 American soldiers killed, and many more wounded by their own artillery. The failed relief attempts highlighted another crucial problem: the tendency to reinforce failure. After Whittlesey's battalion became trapped, division headquarters ordered repeated attacks to rescue them. Each attack was repulsed with heavy casualties, yet headquarters kept ordering more attacks rather than reassessing the strategy. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded in these futile relief efforts. A more competent command structure would have recognized that the relief attacks weren't working and tried different approaches, perhaps attempting to outflank German positions on a broader front rather than attacking directly into prepared defenses. Supply and logistics failures compounded the crisis. Whittlesey's battalion advanced with only one day's rations because they expected to be resupplied quickly. When they became surrounded, no effective supply method existed. Airdrops were attempted, but largely failed due to the forest canopy and lack of precision. The result was soldiers facing death not just from enemy action, but from starvation and dehydration. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that units must be able to sustain themselves for extended periods, but in 1918 this lesson had not been fully learned. Medical evacuation was impossible during the siege, leading to unnecessary deaths. Men with wounds that would have been treatable at field hospitals died in the pocket because they couldn't be evacuated. Battalion Surgeon Captain Feldman did heroic work with inadequate supplies, but many soldiers died from wounds, infections, or complications that proper medical facilities could have addressed. The inability to evacuate wounded became a severe morale problem as soldiers watched their comrades suffer and die, knowing that just a few miles away were hospitals with the means to save them. The question of Whittlesey's decision-making remains controversial. Should he have retreated when he realized his flanks were exposed and his battalion was in danger of being surrounded? Military doctrine generally holds that commanders should use initiative to adapt to changing situations rather than rigidly following orders that no longer make sense. Whittlesey, however, took the opposite approach. He had been ordered to advance and hold, so he did exactly that regardless of the consequences. Some argue this reflected admirable discipline and determination. Others contend it represented a failure of command judgment that unnecessarily cost lives. The Lost Battalion incident influenced American military doctrine in subsequent decades. The Army recognized that better communication technology was essential, This recognition eventually led to the development of portable radios that gave infantry commanders real-time communication with higher headquarters and supporting units. The importance of combined arms coordination, ensuring that infantry, artillery, aircraft, and other elements work together effectively, became a major emphasis in training. The dangers of advancing without secure flanks were emphasized in tactical instruction at military schools. World War I in general, and incidents like the Lost Battalion in particular, demonstrated the need for better officer training. Many American officers in 1918 had minimal training and experience before being thrust into command positions. The rapid expansion of the U.S. Army meant that thousands of officers were commissioned and sent to France with inadequate preparation. This led to predictable mistakes, poor tactical decisions, failures in leadership, inability to adapt to rapidly changing situations. The U.S. Army's response was to dramatically expand and improve its officer education system in the interwar period, establishing schools and programs that continue to this day. The incident also revealed the importance of realistic training. Many American units arrived in France having trained primarily in open terrain, then were immediately sent into combat in the dense Argonne Forest. They had little experience in forest fighting, where visibility was measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, where standard infantry tactics didn't work, and where the terrain itself was as dangerous as the enemy. Modern military training emphasizes preparing for the actual conditions soldiers will face, but in 1918, this principle wasn't consistently applied. Perhaps the most important lesson was recognizing the disconnect between commanders and combat reality. Senior officers at division and corps headquarters, operating from comfortable facilities miles behind the lines, looking at maps and receiving sanitized reports, developed plans that seemed logical on paper but were disastrous in practice. They didn't understand the terrain, didn't appreciate the strength of German defenses, and didn't grasp how difficult it was for exhausted, hungry soldiers to advance through that hellish forest. Modern military doctrine emphasizes that commanders at all levels must understand ground truth, not just map truth, a lesson learned in part from incidents like the Lost Battalion. The Lost Battalion story entered American popular culture almost immediately after the rescue in October 1918. Newspaper coverage was extensive and dramatic, with reporters depicting the siege in heroic terms that captured public imagination. The narrative of American soldiers surrounded and outnumbered, refusing to surrender despite desperate conditions, resonated powerfully with a nation that wanted to believe in the courage and determination of its soldiers. The story became a symbol of American military virtues: toughness, loyalty, refusal to quit even in hopeless circumstances. Books about the Lost Battalion began appearing within years of the war's end. These early accounts, often written by journalists or participants, established a heroic narrative that would dominate for decades. They emphasized courage and sacrifice, while often glossing over the command failures and questionable decisions that had created the crisis. The story was simplified into a clear tale of good versus evil, heroes versus enemies, triumph over adversity. This version of events served public needs for reassurance and inspiration, but sacrificed historical complexity and nuance. Veterans of the Lost Battalion gathered annually through the Lost Battalion Survivors Association, established formally in 1938, though informal reunions had occurred for years before. These gatherings allowed survivors to maintain bonds formed in combat and to commemorate fallen comrades. The reunions were bittersweet affairs, times of fellowship and shared memory, but also painful reminders of those who hadn't survived. As years passed and the survivors aged, the reunion became increasingly focused on preservation and education, ensuring that future generations would remember what had happened in the Argonne Forest. Memorials to the Lost Battalion were established in both the United States and France. In France, the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery became the final resting place for many who died during the offensive, including numerous Lost Battalion casualties. The cemetery, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, receives thousands of visitors annually and serves as a place of remembrance for all Americans who fought in that sector. In 2008, a specific Lost Battalion monument was erected near Bonneville, France, at the site where the battalion had been trapped. The monument dedication ceremony on October 7, 2008, the 90th anniversary of the rescue, drew hundreds of French and American attendees. French school children participated in the ceremony, laying wreaths and learning about the battle that had occurred in their region decades before their birth. The event demonstrated the enduring connection between France and the United States forged during World War I, and the French commitment to preserving the memory of American sacrifice on their soil. Local French teachers regularly bring students to Lost Battalion sites, walking the same trails the soldiers fought over, teaching new generations about the battle. The walking trail through the Lost Battalion sector allows visitors to experience something of the terrain that made the battle so difficult. Hiking through the Argonne Forest today, even with modern paths and in peacetime, one can appreciate how challenging military operations would have been there. The dense vegetation, broken ground, steep ravines, and limited visibility help explain why American units became separated and why German defenders had such advantages. Historical markers along the trail identify significant locations: the pocket where Whittlesey's men were trapped, the German positions that surrounded them, the routes relief forces attempted to use. Films and television productions have brought the Lost Battalion story to mass audiences. The 2001 A&E television movie The Lost Battalion, starring Rick Schroeder as Major Whittlesey, introduced the story to millions who might never have encountered it otherwise. While taking some dramatic liberties, the film generally adhered to historical facts and portrayed both the heroism and horrors of the siege. Such popular culture depictions play crucial roles in historical memory, shaping how contemporary audiences understand past events even when professional historians might quibble with specific details. The story has also been incorporated into American military culture and education. The Lost Battalion is taught at military academies and officer training programs as a case study in leadership, determination, and military ethics. Officers studying the incident grapple with questions about when to follow orders and when to exercise initiative, how to maintain morale in desperate circumstances, and how commanders can lead effectively when resources and support are inadequate. The incident provides rich material for professional military education precisely because it raises difficult questions without easy answers. Historical scholarship on the Lost Battalion has evolved over the decades. Early accounts emphasized heroism and celebrated American virtues. Later historians, with access to more complete records and benefiting from emotional distance, produce more nuanced analyses that examine command failures, question decisions, and place the incident in broader strategic context. Contemporary historians recognize the Lost Battalion as both a story of remarkable courage and an example of how military operations can go catastrophically wrong when planning, intelligence, and execution all fail simultaneously. The fate of Charles Whittlesey has become integral to how the Lost Battalion story is remembered. His suicide 3 years after the war ended adds a tragic coda that complicates the heroic narrative. It forces recognition that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield, and that survivors can be destroyed by psychological wounds even after physical combat ends. Whittlesey's death has made him a symbol for all veterans who struggle with PTSD and the invisible wounds of war. A reminder that heroism in combat doesn't necessarily translate into successful adjustment to civilian life. Cher Army's presence at the Smithsonian Institution ensures that even casual museum visitors encounter the Lost Battalion story. The mounted pigeon in his display case, with his wooden leg and visible wounds, is both poignant and inspiring. The exhibit provides context about carrier pigeons in World War I and explains Cher Army's specific mission. For many visitors, especially children, Cher Army becomes their entry point into learning about the Lost Battalion and World War I more broadly. The pigeon story, more accessible and less troubling in accounts of human death and suffering, serves as a gateway to understanding the larger historical events. Educational materials about the Lost Battalion have been developed for schools. Teachers use the story to teach about World War I, military history, leadership, ethics, and perseverance. The narrative offers opportunities to discuss difficult topics. When is it right to follow orders even when they seem wrong? What responsibilities do commanders have to the soldiers under their command? How do we balance celebration of heroism with acknowledgement of the costs of war? These questions have no simple answers, making the Lost Battalion story valuable for developing critical thinking skills. As the centennial of World War I passed between 2014 and 2018, interest in the Lost Battalion story renewed. Commemorative events, new publications, and increased visitation to battle sites marked the anniversaries. The 100th anniversary of the siege in October 2018 saw ceremonies in both France and the United States, with descendants of survivors attending and honoring their ancestors' service and sacrifice. These centennial commemorations may represent the last time significant numbers of people with direct family connections to Lost Battalion veterans participate in remembrance events, as the biological reality of generational distance continues to separate us from World War I. The question of how the Lost Battalion should be remembered remains contested. Should we emphasize the heroic narrative, brave soldiers refusing to surrender, maintaining cohesion and fighting spirit against overwhelming odds, ultimate rescue and triumph? Or should we focus on the failures, poor planning, inadequate support, unnecessary casualties, the psychological destruction of survivors like Whittlesey? The truth, of course, encompasses both. The soldiers' courage was real and remarkable. The command failures were also real and contributed to unnecessary suffering. A complete historical understanding requires holding both truths simultaneously, acknowledging complexity rather than reducing the story to simple lessons or easy morals. More than a century after the siege in the Argonne Forest, the Lost Battalion story continues to resonate in American culture and military tradition. The incident has transcended its specific historical moment to become a symbol of determination, courage under extreme adversity, and the bonds between soldiers facing death together. Understanding why this particular World War I battle has maintained such cultural prominence reveals much about how societies remember war and construct narratives of national identity. The Lost Battalion story endures partly because it fits archetypal narrative patterns that humans find compelling. The tale contains elements of classic tragedy and triumph. Heroes facing impossible odds, isolation from support, refusal to surrender, suffering and sacrifice, and ultimate rescue. These narrative elements appear across cultures and throughout history, from ancient epics to modern films. The Lost Battalion story taps into these deep narrative traditions, making it immediately accessible and emotionally resonant even to audiences far removed from 1918. The incident also represents broader themes about American military culture and national identity. Americans like to see themselves as resilient, determined, refusing to quit even when circumstances seem hopeless. The Lost Battalion exemplifies these values, surrounded, starving, under constant attack, yet refusing German surrender demands and maintaining organizational discipline until rescued. For a nation that values individualism and determination, the story provides a powerful example of these virtues operating within a military context. The human scale of the story contributes to its enduring appeal. World War I was characterized by mass armies, industrial-scale slaughter, and strategic movements involving millions of soldiers across vast fronts. Individual experiences could easily disappear into statistics about divisions, corps, and armies. The Lost Battalion story, by contrast, focuses on a specific group of identifiable individuals, approximately 550 men whose names we know, led by commanders whose personalities and decisions we can examine. This human scale makes the story more accessible than abstract discussions of strategies and casualty figures. The story's complexity prevents it from becoming simplistic propaganda. While often told as a heroic narrative, the Lost Battalion incident also involves command failures, questionable decisions, and tragic costs that complicate any simple celebration. Whittlesey's decision not to retreat when his flanks collapsed remains controversial. Was it admirable discipline or poor judgment that unnecessarily cost lives? His later suicide adds another layer of complexity. Can we celebrate someone as a hero while acknowledging that the experience destroyed him psychologically? These ambiguities keep the story intellectually engaging rather than reducing it to simple platitudes about courage and victory. The Lost Battalion's legacy influenced how subsequent generations of American military leaders approach command. Officers studying the incident learned lessons about the importance of communication, the dangers of rigid adherence to orders in fluid situations, the need for commanders to understand actual ground conditions rather than relying on maps, and the responsibility leaders have to protect soldiers under their command. While not always consistently applied, these lessons have influenced American military culture and doctrine for over a century. The story has particular relevance for understanding combat trauma and PTSD. Whittlesey's suicide forced public recognition that war's psychological toll could destroy survivors years after combat ended. His case became one of many that eventually led to better understanding of combat stress and development of treatment approaches for what we now call PTSD. Every generation produces veterans struggling with psychological wounds from combat, and the Lost Battalion story, particularly Whittlesey's tragic end, reminds us that these invisible injuries are as real and potentially as deadly as physical wounds. Cher Army's role in the story has given it cross-generational appeal. Children who might not engage with accounts of military strategy or combat descriptions connect with the story of a brave pigeon flying through enemy fire to deliver a message. Cher Army serves as an accessible entry point for younger audiences to learn about World War I military history and concepts like courage, determination, and sacrifice. The pigeon's continuing presence at the Smithsonian ensures that new generations encounter the Lost Battalion story through this remarkable animal hero. The incident highlights the relationship between individual agency and institutional systems. Individual soldiers, from Whittlesey and McMurtry to privates holding perimeter, made choices that determined whether they survived. They demonstrated agency, courage, and capability even within a military hierarchy that constrained their options. Yet the story also shows how institutional failures, poor planning, inadequate intelligence, communication breakdowns, can create situations where even extraordinary individual performance barely suffices for survival. This tension between individual and institution remains relevant in understanding military operations and institutional performance generally. The Franco-American commemorative partnership around Lost Battalion sites demonstrates how shared historical memory can strengthen international relationships. French communities in the Argonne region have embraced the Lost Battalion story as part of their local history, maintaining sites, educating students, and participating in commemorative events. This effort reflects French gratitude for American intervention in World War I and commitment to preserving memory of that sacrifice. The partnership shows how historical memory can be collaborative across national boundaries, creating connections between peoples separated by geography and time. As biological connection to World War I fades, the last veterans died decades ago, and even their children are now elderly, the nature of how we remember events like the Lost Battalion changes. Memory becomes increasingly mediated through institutions, texts, and constructed commemorations rather than personal family connections and oral traditions. This transition is inevitable but creates challenges for maintaining engagement with historical events. The Lost Battalion story has navigated this transition relatively successfully, remaining culturally relevant even as direct connections disappear. The incident raises enduring questions about military ethics and the morality of warfare. Was it right for commanders to order Whittlesey's battalion into an exposed position? Should Whittlesey have followed those orders when doing so meant probable death for many of his men? What obligations did commanders at division headquarters have to rescue the trapped battalion? And was the cost in lives during failed relief attempts justified? These ethical questions have no simple answers, but wrestling with them helps develop more sophisticated understanding of the moral complexities inherent in military command and warfare generally. The story serves as a reminder of war's human cost beyond battlefield casualties. The 107 killed, 190 wounded, and 63 missing represent obvious costs. But the psychological destruction of survivors like Whittlesey, the grief of families who lost loved ones, the lifelong disabilities of wounded veterans, the economic costs of medical care and pensions, all these represent war's true price. The Lost Battalion story, by following participants beyond the immediate battle, helps audiences understand that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield and persist for generations. The incident has influenced popular culture beyond direct retellings. Elements of the Lost Battalion story appear in novels, films, and other media that draw on a narrative pattern of isolated military units facing overwhelming odds. The archetypal story of the surrounded unit that refuses to surrender has been retold countless times in various settings, but many of these retellings consciously or unconsciously draw on the Lost Battalion template. In this way, the incident has shaped broader cultural narratives about warfare, heroism, and survival. Educational value ensures the story's continued relevance. Military academies, history courses, leadership programs, and ethics classes use the Lost Battalion as case study material. The incident provides rich opportunities to examine decision-making under pressure, leadership in crisis, the fog of war, civil-military relations, and numerous other topics relevant to military and organizational studies. As long as institutions need case studies to teach these concepts, the Lost Battalion story will remain in use. The mystery of the 63 missing soldiers continues to fascinate. What exactly happened to these men who vanished during the siege? Were they killed by artillery? Captured and died in prison camps? Executed? Did some escape individually and simply never return? The inability to definitively answer these questions adds an element of mystery that keeps the story engaging. Every unsolved historical mystery represents human stories left incomplete. Individuals whose fates remain unknown, a reminder that even our best historical accounts leave gaps and unanswered questions. Ultimately, the Lost Battalion's legacy persists because the story encapsulates fundamental truths about human experience and extremity. It shows people facing death, hunger, thirst, pain, and fear, the most basic human vulnerabilities, and responding with courage, loyalty, determination, and mutual support. These responses aren't unique to 1918 or to military situations. They represent how humans can behave when circumstances push them to their limits. The story reassures us that people can endure terrible circumstances, that courage and determination exist, that individuals can maintain integrity even when everything conspires to break them. The Lost Battalion story will likely continue to be told, studied, and commemorated as long as people care about military history, leadership, courage, and the human experience of war. New generations will discover the incident through museums, books, films, and educational programs. Some will visit the sites in France where it occurred, walking the trails and try to imagine what those 6 days were like. Others will encounter the story in leadership courses or history classes. Descendants of survivors will continue passing down family stories about grandfathers and great-grandfathers who lived through that hell in the Argonne Forest. The nearly 200 men who walked out of that ravine on October 7, 1918, carry the rest of their lives within the memories of those 6 days. For better and worse, the siege defined them. They were the men of the Lost Battalion. And that identity never left them. More than a century later, we remember their ordeal not just to honor their courage and sacrifice, but to understand something profound about human resilience, the cost of war, the responsibilities of leadership, and the bonds formed between people facing death together. Their story remains, outlasting the individuals who lived it, continuing to teach and inspire new generations who will never experience what they endured but can learn from their example. The Lost Battalion story reminds us that courage often comes with invisible scars that last far longer than the battle itself. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to see more untold stories from history's darkest moments. Drop a comment below. Do you think Major Whittlesey made the right decision to hold his position, or should he have retreated to save lives? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you want to learn about another military disaster that shocked the world, click the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and remember, history's greatest lessons often come from its most tragic moments.